Welcome. First, I'd like to thank, my name is Mike Socolow. I'm here from the University of Maine. I'll talk a little bit about who I am in a minute. But first, I'd like to thank the Rockland Public Library and M. Lewis for inviting me to present some research in progress, and that's what this is, and discuss some Maine radio history with you here tonight. I really appreciate it. This isn't going to be a lecture. I want to be clear about that. I love radio, and I love to hear people's experiences and thoughts about radio. Radio is what I study. And I'm a media historian who teaches in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. And my scholarship is really focused on radio history. I'm also currently the director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center on campus. I love history, and my PhD is actually in media history. And so I'll get to my work in a minute, but I want to start with radio. And I actually would like to hear, I want to also solicit from the Zoom people, like what would you say? Because you'll understand when I get to radio in Maine in the 20s and 30s in terms of framing, but what would you say makes radio special? Like what makes it effective? What do you like about radio? The intimacy. Okay, so it's interpersonal, it's intimate. Any other things? It definitely is. Why do you think radio, I mean, another question is, why do you think radio has persisted for a century? I mean, 1920 is the KDKA broadcast. And here we are in 2022, 102 years later. And for those of you who don't know, the statistics about radio remains it actually technically remains the most pervasive and consumed medium in the United States. 91% of Americans tune in terrestrial, what we call terrestrial or broadcast radio in a given week, which is more than the internet, more than social media, more than books, more than newspapers. It's the #1 consumed medium today, 102 years later. So it obviously has something, and whenever I mention that statistic, everybody's like, well, it's the car, right? It's that everybody listens to it in the car. That's the only place they do. But even when you think about podcasting and other ways we consume audio in today's world, that's on top of the terrestrial or satellite radio. So clearly, it's a very important media, and it gets completely overlooked. It would be one of my arguments because I'm in favor of it. Everybody still loves radio, and I agree. I think the #1 reason is it's intimate. It's like a phone call. A lot of people forget that when radio began, there was a lawsuit between AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, and the Radio Corporation of America, and the lawsuit was based on a very simple premise. AT&T charged money to use the microphone on a radio station because they said radio was a telephone call to 1 million people simultaneously. They were in New York. That was their patent. RCA said, no, it's actually something different. It doesn't use the lines. It goes through the air or whatever. They settled. It didn't go through the lawsuit or whatever. But that idea that radio is a telephone call to millions of people at the same time, I think gets to what makes it so powerful, what makes it work so well in that. Sometimes it feels like people are talking directly to us. It's like a telephone conversation we're eavesdropping on. But it's also engaging, and it resonates in ways that we sometimes don't even realize, like when you spin the dial and you change it because it's not engaging you in a certain way. Radio is intimate. It's Marshall McLuhan's famous quote was, it's like psyche and society in a single echo chamber, right? Because you know there's people out there. You're not only listening to the host, but you know there's millions of other people listening at the same time, creating that audience with you. And that shared aspect is also really important. Okay, so we've established the importance of radio. For tonight's talk, I'm actually to begin by talking about radio preservation that's happening up at the University of Maine. I'm on something called the Radio Preservation Task Force, which the Library of Congress convened about 10 years ago with the idea that it's a group of scholars, radio activists, and enthusiasts, people from the community who understand the importance of preserving radio history. The RPTF has meetings in Washington, D.C., where we discuss archival materials, obstacles to preservation. The biggest one is copyright, because all the old radio is owned by CBS, NBC, and others, and Fox, actually. And the best methods to make radio as it existed over the last century accessible to the public. Now, Maine and Maine, I'll get to this in a second, but Maine is, oh wait, sorry. So let me just, this is my book about radio in the Berlin 1936 Olympics. And that's part of my scholarship about radio. But Maine has a terrific record of radio preservation, one of the best in the United States. And it's because of a lot of reasons, but the major one, a big major one, is this gentleman, Barry Darling. He's starting over a decade ago in 2010, he approached Fogler Library at University of Maine with a big collection of WLBZ records. And he offered to help catalog and digitize them. This is precisely the kind of important effort at historical preservation that the Library of Congress is really excited about. And actually, at an RPTF conference in 2018 in DC, I did a presentation on some of Barry's WLBZ work with his permission and collaboration and credit. I'm not going to take credit for him. So what he did is he was a general manager at WLBZ. His father knew Thompson L. Guernsey, who founded LBZ in 1925 in a chicken coop in Dover Foxcroft. And his father had rescued the recordings, put them in his own basement. And then he, Barry Darling, who had been a general manager of LBZ from the 60s, went to Fogler after he retired and said, I have this, would you like them? And they built him this digitization place, which could do 78s, could do all kinds of recordings. And so he digitized stuff. And then they created a web page that they debuted in 2015. You can see it there, called the WLBZ web page. And it's filled with wonderful old Maine stuff. So for instance, they interviewed Norman Gallant, who was an announcer from the 1920s for the Maine Association of Broadcasters. And his interview about early radio in the 1920s in Bangor is accessible. You can actually just download it from the web. A special collections librarian named Desiree Butterfield Nagy was very important in this. And it debuted in 2015 as part of Maine Digital Humanities Week. And I'm going to play a little 2-minute clip right here of one thing from.
Senator McCarthy of the Scientists Committee on Loyalty and Security of the Federation of American Scientists says that your inquiries into alleged spying at the Fort Monmouth radar laboratories has caused, this is a quote, a very real and immediate damage to the defense program. What is your view on their view?
Bill, all I can say is I've been down there, and I think the good loyal Americans down there want to get rid of the communist potential espionage agents. I do think we are demoralizing the Communist Party. I hope we continue. I don't think we're demoralizing any good Americans.
Well, the group says that morale among the professional staff is very poor, according to reports, and that a high percentage of scientists not implicated in the present investigation are now planning to seek employment elsewhere. Any comment on that?
Bill, I can only comment by asking the question. Why would a good loyal American have his morale ruined because you dig out communist spies?
Our United Press Wire said this morning that your investigation of General Electric now involves Lynn, Massachusetts. That's close to home here. Have you any plans for any communist investigations in Maine?
2 of our investigators have been up at Lynn for some time.
How about the Maine angle?
I frankly couldn't tell you at this time, Bill. We've had complaints about communist infiltration in so many plants that are supplying the government with top secret, confidential material. We cannot investigate all of them. Our staff is limited. We hope to go to.
Oh, sorry. Okay. What do you think? How do you think that clip is helpful for historians, students, or what do you think of that clip? What does that clip tell you? Anti-communism, it's still. It's interesting because the students will be learning about Senator McCarthy at the national level and Edward R. Murrow. But what about the way the reporter talked to him? Remember, this is 1952. This is a long time before McCarthy's on the way up right in 52. He doesn't go down till 54, 55. Did you think the local reporter was going along with him? Or am I reading too much into it to hear a little skepticism? What do you think? I wonder. I mean, it's an interesting question, and this is the great why radio preservation is so important. So people can look back later and say, you know, the reporter to me, maybe it's just me, sounded a teeny bit suspicious. Are there communists in Maine? Of course, McCarthy's going to say there's communists. Oh, that's interesting. He does say, well, we don't really have the resources to find the communists in Maine. But even kind of asking that question, I thought was kind of an interesting. He's not presupposing communists in Maine, and he's not even presupposing the ones in Lynn. He's sort of, I don't know, taking it's maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the point is that's the kind of original recording stuff that goes back to the 20s actually. But the problem is with the collection, most of the 20s stuff are commercials that aired on LBZ. That's what they end up keeping rather than some of the programs. But that's an example of why it's so important. Additional archival materials at Fogo Library include this fellow named Floyd Gibbs. Have any of you heard of Floyd Gibbs? Anybody? The headline hunter? Floyd Gibbs had America's first newscast, daily newscast, national daily newscast on NBC, sponsored by Literary Digest. It was called The Headline Hunter. He was a Chicago Tribune war reporter. He lost his eye in World War I, so he had an eye patch. This is a promo picture from the thing. And he was huge. He was making $10,000 a week in 1930 on The Headline Hunter. Literary Digest, he had the highest ratings. He actually, at one point, Literary Digest wanted to have him more on the air, so they actually bought time on CBS. So he aired his newscast aired. It was called The Headline Hunter, but it was really commentary on the day's news. It wasn't reporting as we understand it. It was kind of like it's kind of like the way Rush Limbaugh would read an article and then comment on it. He's very much forgotten. His spot was taken over. Sadly, he was an alcoholic and became very unreliable very quickly within 2 years with all that money. And his spot was taken over by someone named Lowell Thomas, who became very, very famous. Good night, everyone, and all that, and that. But the University of Maine, because somehow his papers, I heard that his brother lived in Bangor and ended up taking care of him at the end of his life, and that's how they ended up in Fogo Library. All the scripts from America's very first newscast exist at Fogo Library at University of Maine. So it's a great place and a great school to research radio. Okay. Now, for the work I'm doing on actual Maine radio, I've signed a contract with an academic university press for a book that's called Channeling America. That's the title. And its basic question asks, why in the United States did we have only two major networks at the start of the radio age, CBS and NBC? You know, why didn't we have 5, 7, or 10? We have that many local radio stations in different cities. Why didn't companies affiliate and do that? And what were sort of the technological, economic, political, sociocultural variables that developed national radio as it did? And one of the chapters is going to be essentially a case study of how national, local, and regional, because we had the Yankee and Colonial network here in Maine, all intersected in one state. And because Maine has such great archival materials, and since I teach at the University of Maine, and we have all these great materials, the chapter will be on Maine. And Maine is not representative. As I'm about to show you, Maine played a huge and outsized role in national radio right when it started, that it never would capture again. It was kind of the center of national radio. This is a work in progress. The chapter's not actually composed yet. So I'll give you a preview of the chapter and discuss that a little bit. Here's the summary of what the chapter is doing from the book proposal. This chapter builds on the previous chapter by examining local, regional, and national radio and how it interacted in a single US state. That state is Maine, where local archival sources will be matched with national network and federal sources to illustrate the ways in which the American commercial system accommodated and synthesized local, regional, and national broadcast imperatives in network radio's first 2 decades. With early national radio stars on NBC, such as Rudy Valley, star of the popular Fleischman's East Hour, and Phillips Lord, creator and star of the hit program Seth Parker, Maine played an outsized role on America's early radio imagination. National publications like the New York Times, New Yorker, Collier's all published features on Maine and its national network radio presence. At the same time, within the state, the local operators often ran into commercial difficulties, regulatory obstacles, and other issues that made developing the local radio industry here in Maine actually difficult. In the case of stations such as WLBZ Bangor, affiliation with a national network, and WLBZ, interestingly, was one of CBS's first stations. The original CBS, when the first date went on the air, LBZ was one of 26 stations that was affiliated with it. But the CBS affiliation was a huge problem for LBZ because of the way clearance worked. So for instance, one story is LBZ could easily sell to local advertisers the basketball tournament that, in the Civic Center at Bangor, but CBS wouldn't let them because CBS had already sold the time for national programs and things like that. So that's an example of the kind of tension I'm talking about. This tension and conflict with network management over program clearance and low remittance for airtime persisted within the relationship between Maine's local stations and the national networks for decades. The chapter will also explain how regional networks, such as the Colonial and Yankee networks, help defray program expenses while providing commercial revenue. The regional networks in Maine actually bonded Maine audiences in the state with other communities throughout New England, creating an interesting kind of identity that was mediated between the local and the national. And when I think about that, does anybody know why, this is such an arcade little point, but why the Colonial and Yankee networks existed? There was one program that originally put them together. Well, the other thing is, have any of you heard of the Colonial and Yankee? Because they both disappeared in the 50s. The Yankee network, they were started by a Boston, the Shepherd stores. John Shepherd, who owned a department store in Boston, WEI, it was Red Sox and Braves games. It was selling Red Sox and Braves games throughout New England. And there was an audience built in here. He could buy the time cheap. And it was essentially free money. All they had to do was turn on the transmitter, get the Red Sox game from Boston, and Shepherd, in exchange for letting him sell the time on the whole network, Shepherd, he gave some time back to LBZ or ABI or whoever was the local affiliate. And actually, believe it or not, here's an interesting thing about it. It persists to this day. How many of you heard the term Red Sox Nation? Yeah. Red Sox Nation was built through radio. It wasn't built through TV. It wasn't built through any of this. It was built through the Colonial and Yankee networks in the 30s and 40s. And actually, it's one of the funny things. I was looking through one of the archival collections, and the Red Sox were so bad in the 1950s that they had to ship fake stadium sounds to each of the radio stations on the chain to play because the attendance was so low in Fenway Park. The Braves, interestingly, the Braves were worth a lot. I didn't know this. I'm not actually from Boston, Bangor, or New England. I didn't know the Braves were the #1 team right up until they left, pretty much. Is that, you disagree? I know they were worth more money in the terms of the radio programming, but that may have been. But what were you gonna say?
Well, they had a terrible thing, and they both did. But I know this, that the attendance was so bad at Braves Field that you could get in with 2 box tops from Kellogg's Corn Flakes or something like that, and you'd see going with supermarkets, small supermarkets, box tops ripped off by kids. So they could get in free to see the
Interesting. And the other thing that was really strange was the Red Sox and the Braves played very close to each other. The Braves Stadium at Boston University is a very short walk to Fenway, which always surprised me. But the reason, now that I think about it, and I'm remembering this, the reason the Braves games were worth more is in the late 40s, they were very good. They went to a World Series, I think, in like 48, I think with Johnny Saints. And I think there was some kind of like hangover for broadcasting. That team had been so good. And that's the era I'm looking at. That's the era of the LBZ and it's much bigger in the late 40s than in the 20s. So anyway, that's just that's a tidbit of this persistence of radio into today's world. People say Red Sox Nation without even thinking about it. And it's part of this world that I'm looking at. Okay, that's the academic version of my chapter, but it's filled with stories about how and when radio first came to Maine. And one of the things that's kind of interesting in Maine is that by looking at this very local lens, is the genres and modes and styles of radio that today we take for granted. Like we think a newscast is separate from a sports broadcast, is separate from a religious broadcast. But in the early 1920s, this was unclear. A sports broadcast could be entertainment or news during the thing. And actually, it's interesting. I've published some on the history of sports broadcasting, and it was newscasters who did sports at first, and they were very unemotional, and they delivered it as, like, Ted Husing was one of America's biggest sportscasters. He was a news person first. Anyway, a great example of this idea that the definitions of programs weren't defined is WABI Bangor, which was purchased. Let me see, I have a good picture of it here. Oh, I'll come back to this in a sec. WABI Bangor was purchased by actually it wasn't purchased, it was run by the Unitarian Church on Park Street in Bangor. It's Maine's oldest continuously operating radio station to today. It went on the air 99 years ago this June. And it was started by the Bangor Electric and Railway Company. And interestingly, every Sunday morning, they would flip the switch and put on the Unitarian Church service program. And and I don't want to get too into the weeds here. Electric companies around America ran stations at first because they thought it was an easy way to sell electricity. You plug in your radio at home, and work with RCA. So this wasn't uncommon, but it was costing money and they didn't like it. So they actually handed the license. They went to Dr. Ashley Smith of the Unitarian Church and said, "Hey, you're our number one star. We'll give you we'll put the antenna on your church and give you everything for free if you agree to assume the license and run it." And he said, of course he's going to say yes, why not, right? So he turned over the license for free in 1925, right after this picture was taken. And that's the background of the story I'm going to tell, which I dug out of the WABI materials from the 1930s, which are actually in the attic of the church today on Park Street. Totally unaccessioned, series of correspondence and whatever. And I found letters that tell this really interesting story that I'm actually probably going to open my chapter with. So here's how it begins. It was late January 1932 when one afternoon Carl Danforth bumped into Dr. Ashley Smith, the pastor of the First Universalist Society of Bangor, Maine, on the street in Bangor. The two exchanged pleasantries before Smith stepped forward and said, quote, "I'd like to ask you a question." "All right," Danforth replied. "As man to man, is there any feeling towards me personally which is keeping you from going to church?" Dr. Smith asked. "Yes," Danforth admitted. "I don't like your methods." "In what way?" Smith asked. "Well, the radio. I wrote you a long time ago that you were spoiling the service for me with your full announcements of the radio programs. And later on, when you were giving radio advertising, I found that objectionable," Danforth explained. Smith didn't challenge the charge that he proffered radio advertising from the pulpit. In fact, he admitted it. "I was trying hard," here's what he said to Danforth, "I was trying hard to help reduce the debt on the Dorothy Memorial Hall, which was a big building they'd built behind the church right before the Depression hit. And perhaps all the people don't feel as you, as the increase in the members of the church in our society might indicate," he defensively explained. And he was justifying in this letter the promotion of commercial radio from his pulpit every Sunday. He was reading radio advertisements from the pulpit. This brief and acrimonious exchange between an exasperated parishioner and his clergyman over the appropriate place of radio advertising during a Sunday service, to me, it provides kind of an illuminating and revealing snapshot of the sort of discussions that arose widely during radio's initial development in the United States. It wasn't clear, the distinction between religious and commercial broadcasting. It hadn't fully emerged. So the idea that a church might be selling advertising to commercial sponsors and then plug those same sponsors directly from the pulpit to defray the cost of the radio broadcasting, it was novel to repel some parishioners, but it attracted others apparently. So that's sort of where my chapter begins, that everything was kind of in formulation. You can look at it by focusing narrowly on the local. Okay. There were other innovations in Maine. The other big one was called and I'm curious if any of you have heard of this one, the First Radio Parish Church of America in Portland, Maine. What have you heard of it?
I know. Very well.
It's a hugely important in radio history, and it's interesting because it was started on WCSH, and everybody kind of wonders what happened. Was that article on the left is front page A1 of the New York Times in 1926. It was so surprising that this Reverend Hoff left the Adventist church to develop this first radio parish, the Advent Christian Church, to develop something called the first radio parish in America. That it was a front page article in the New York Times. In its 25th year, it was on the front page of the New York Times again. And you could make an argument, by the way, it ended in 2018, the radio show on WCSH, the last version of it. So, I mean, that's amazing, 91 years of a program. But you can make an argument, I don't know if I'm gonna make this argument yet, I haven't finished my research yet, that this is where televangelism comes from. This is the entire world of moving into broadcasting. Before Amy Semple McPherson, before Jimmy Swaggart and all the stuff that comes in TV in the 70s and stuff, that this moment when this reverend decides the physical grouping of people in his community isn't as important as the ethereal one, is a hugely important innovation. If you think about it in American history, and it happened in Portland, Maine. I don't know why it happened in Portland, Maine. I haven't figured it out.
I think I heard that Reverend started with all this WCSH TV, pick a man, all of it, many
Yeah, it could be. It's the Rhines family. The Rhines family, right. But that's another innovation I'll be looking at from the local up to the national in that sense. So now let's look at national. I just talked about local examples. Here are the national. I had mentioned that Maine played an outsized role in national radio. At one point in 1930, and this is an article from the New York Times called Life Way Down East Wins Radio Applause in 1930. At the time this article was written in July 1930, 3 of the top 5 radio programs in the United States on NBC were set in Maine. And not only that, Rudy Valley's Maine Stein song was the #1 song in America. And it was through, it was Seth Parker. Have any of you heard of Seth Parker? Phillips Lord was the name of the creator of Seth Parker. He went to Bowdoin. He was raised in Lucerne, Maine, or Phillips Lake area, just south of Bangor, north of Ellsworth. And after he graduated from Bowdoin, he always dreamed, he was a school teacher, but he always dreamed of writing plays. He wanted to be a playwright. And radio had just come in, and he sent plays down to an NBC in New York. And somebody hired him to turn his plays about his home life in Jonesport, Maine, a made up kind of fictional thing. Jonesport's real, but Seth Parker was a made up thing. They said, if you work with us, we'll put it on Sundays as kind of a homily type thing. It was sort of a friendly religious thing. And so he moved down to New York. He becomes a vice president of NBC. And I have a thing here. And he becomes this enormously important person with the #1 show in America from 1930 to 32. He's a fictional preacher. There's Phillips Lord for the thing. His papers are out in Wisconsin. That's what the show is about. It was rural. The show drew on the charm of rural Maine and colorful characters. Every episode, so it was like a serial. It was kind of but it was sort of it had a comedy aspect too. And sometimes it got kind of racy, as they mentioned, because as they mentioned here, there was alcohol, drinking, because this is when Prohibition comes in. There were trysts, there were sea shanties. It all kind of revolved around the wholesome preacher. The show would end up, no matter how weird, how strange the issue got, it would end up with a biblical quote. So to kind of tie it all together and make it clear that Reverend Parker, everything's good back in Jonesport. And it was so popular that, in fact, they asked him to make a second show basically based on it, which is the one, that's Uncle Abe, which was called Uncle Abe, which was a Cracker Barrel general store in Skowhegan, Maine. And it wasn't nearly as popular. It was still at its height, it was right there. And enormously popular programming, as well as the thing about Rudy Valley's Maine Stein song is, and by the way, so what happened was it became so huge, Seth Parker, that Hollywood came and asked him to make movies about Jonesport, Maine. And Way Back Home was one of the top. You'll notice the sound is kind of off. And it's because this is just when talkie started, early 1930.
But I wouldn't swing it over my head like you did yesterday. You might spill some. Oh, Mom, it ain't no fun lugging Malcolm unless you can swing it. I won't spill none. Look. Oh.
Anyway, it's set in Maine.
Yeah.
That's Seth
Is it
Parker
true?
right there.
Ain't you and Mom my real father and mother?
Solving some problem. Anyway, it was a big hit movie. It was a top 5 movie in 1930. It was called Way Back Home, and he also wrote 2 bestsellers based on Seth Parker. So he was sort of a person of all media. Fascinating. And Rudy Valley's Maine Stein song was to this day, the only #1 hit for a college music theme or song ever. And it's interesting what people say about it. It was featured in many movies, as you can see. If you go through YouTube, you'll come across, it kept coming back into movies because it was so popular. It's a great song. If you've never heard it. And actually, just when I was looking earlier, I saw they made a cartoon of it very early in 1930. I don't even know this cartoon. I should put it on. This, again, is
rare compositions that wins over all listeners.
I know you all love the old Maine Stein. I wish you would join us in singing it.
Yeah, it's going to
Find
be,
it easy to keep in time.
again, less than a year after Al Jolson and Talkies came in. So a lot of people ascribe its #1 to the fact that it had these movies aspect and the Talkies. So that's Rudy Valley. Now, and then on the regulatory side, Senator Wallace White, who was from, I think it's from Bath or Brunswick or something, a longtime senator, was the co-author of the Radio Act of 1927. And he was always very interested in radio. He was always meeting with people at NBC and CBS through radio and the television transition. So he played a major role in Maine on the national airwaves. So that's pretty much where I am. I'm doing the research now. I'm writing this chapter this summer. But before we get to points, I want to point out there's the Maine Memory Network has terrific radio archives in the Maine Historical Society. This is the Rhines WCSH, the original 1926 station run by 7 people. And on it says, this is the original staff taking, for those of you who don't know, WCSH is Congress Square Hotel, because the Rhines family owned Congress Square Hotel. It's still WCSH, by the way, although they're trying to change the branding to News Center Maine, but the license is still Congress Square Hotel. 1926. And the story here is that it started as Portland radio station WTAJ in 23, but it was ran out of a radio shop on Exchange Street. It's funny that they say before they turned it over to the Haskells and then it went to CSH because one day he was walking up Congress Street and none of the department store owners wanted the radio station. The only person who expressed an interest was Henry Rhines, who owned the Eastland Hotel in Congress Square. So one of the things that's interesting about early radio is people were nobody knew how to make money with these things, and they cost money with the electricity. So as you can see in Maine, at least 2 very important stations were handed over for free. And I guess I'll end with this one, which is one thing we think about radio today is so interpersonal. It's in the car, we tune the dial, we do all these kind of things. But when radio actually started in the early 1920s, it was communal, and it stayed that way up to the 1930s in the South, because of the radios were expensive. And so you would invite your friends over and you would put it on your porch in the summer and people would listen together and discuss as they listened. That was the first way. And this is a wonderful picture from 1923, when the world's heavyweight championship fight was radio broadcast on July 4th to downtown Portland. Jack Dempsey versus Tommy Gibbons. And this is a great example of how radio really brought the community together even before people had it in their homes. And as you can imagine, this is 99 years ago this summer. This would have been an absolutely mind-boggling. This would have been way beyond the internet for us to walk downtown in Portland and hear a boxing match live from Montana for the world's heavyweight championship in the middle of the day, to actually hear it through loudspeakers. And that's kind of the magic. I'll wrap up where I began. Like, that's the magic of radio that I find so interesting. So that's Maine on the national, local, regional networks. And if you have any questions or discussions or thoughts, I'm very glad to hear those. It absolutely did, because interestingly, NBC and CBS paid very little for affiliation, very little. I mean, it was something like $50 for a night, which sounds like a lot in 1920s. $50 would have been thousands today, but they could have sold their local stations for more. And when Mutual came in 1936, they were willing to pay whatever the local station charged them, Mutual was, instead of what CBS or NBC insisted that they gave to the local station. And so immediately, I think it was CSH, the biggest station in Portland, left NBC and went to Mutual. And it caused a huge problem because people in Portland were angry about it, but the station was making a lot more money and they complained to the FCC. So that's one example. The other famous example is nobody bought sports rights in the early 1930s. And Mutual paid a huge sum for the 34 World Series, something like $100,000, which during the Depression would have been millions. And it infuriated people around America because Mutual was teeny. And they had the World Series, which everybody wanted to listen to, and it had been free up to that point. So that's how Mutual changed the dynamic in that way. Did Mutual have? It's Mutual, technically you weren't an affiliate with Mutual because you just had to. Mutual started by WOR New York, WLW Cincinnati, WGN Chicago, and I forget did I say WLW Cincinnati? Yeah. It was started by 4 stations, and their deal was very simple. We're not CBS or NBC. We're not going to insist you put our show on. If we want your station, we'll come to you, pay. And it was more of an exchange than an affiliation. It was a much more fair deal, but they didn't have all the stars. So NBC and CBS could leverage Jack Benny. Nobody wanted to miss Jack Benny because you didn't make any money off Jack Benny, but you made money off as soon as his show ended and before it began, because so many people flocked to it. Which, by the way, is the way it works today in primetime. The local stations don't make money from 8 to 11. They make their money on the local news that starts at 11 and between 7 and 8 when they run the syndicated shows like Jeopardy that aren't network.
Yes, hello.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, this is Rich from Palermo. Phil Lord had an interesting career in radio, and it went beyond Seth. And I think he might have been involved with the production of other radio programs, such as Gang. He had a campground in Surrey called The Gatherings, which as a kid I went to for 2 or 3 summers in the mid-19. My history may be wrong, but I think his brother had something to do with buttressing the University of Southern Maine in Portland back in the early days.
No, your history is 100% correct. Everything you just said, that he lived until the 1970s. So the first thing that you said, that he was much more involved in radio than what I said. Absolutely. After these 3 big hits, NBC made him the director of all their programming. And he couldn't write the scripts anymore. His wife, and it's very interesting, his wife got credit on the movie and the book, but it becomes very clear that when he became too busy, his wife was doing all the writing and he was doing the directing and he was doing the business part. And a lot of people who studied it say she didn't get enough credit, frankly. But that was what you just said about Gangbusters and the other shows. Yes, he became the senior vice president. And as NBC grew through the 30s, he became more and more important, to the point that NBC ran 2 networks called the Red and the Blue. And he was basically the person running the entire Blue network, the entire other network. A hugely important person in the history of American radio, totally separate from Maine, which my chapter will go into, by the way. My chapter today, I just want to talk about his relationship very closely to Maine. And the thing about the camp is true. He loved Maine. He came back here every chance he could. He had a boat on the coast. The brother in USM, I wasn't sure about, but I knew his family stayed here and had tons of local connections. So that's great. Yeah, that's very true. He got in trouble with some of his programs. Gangbusters is an example. Gangbusters was incredibly controversial because you know how it opened? You ever heard the expression coming on like gangbusters with all the guns and stuff? And he had to defend it in front of the FCC and stuff. And it was very strange because you had this guy who had done this preacher show, who had done this religious show, defending a gangsters, a show. And the thing about Gangbusters that made it really controversial, it was the first crime show, even though they were doing it with the FBI, that was pitched to kids. It was the first crime show that was actually explicitly at 7 o'clock when kids could hear it, and it was made for kids. And so as you can imagine with the kind of controversies we have in today's world, it was even more bizarre back then, but he was the person in charge of that too. Yeah. Were you gonna ask him? No.
I was going to say that I can't remember early television, not that many people, but people would gather outside the radio television store that would have the television going. Starring people, crowds of people would be staring at it, not even listen because there was
That's it, I mean, it was incredible. One thing that's kind of cool about Maine that I really like. Now, Maine has a problem because it has mountains, but in terms of reception, the stony ground and the granite that makes farming so difficult here makes radio unbelievably good when it bounces back and forth from the ionosphere. So all throughout the South in the 1930s, they had reception issues with the humidity and the electric storms all summer long. Radio reception was terrible, TV reception. And even to this day, it's just not good down there. Up here, Maine had crystal clear, incredible reception from around America. And to this day, if you go on your AM dial, depending on where you are in Maine, if you're in the mountains, but if you're here by the coast, by the water, by the salt water, you will pick up WLBT Charlotte, North Carolina on your AM dial here in Rockland on a summer. It has to be when the sun's down, after the sun is down. You'll pick up the huge 50,000 watt AM stations that still exist. You'll pick up the Wheeling, West Virginia one, You'll pick up LBT Charlotte. That's about as far. Sometimes you can get WJR Detroit. Well, Canada, yeah, the maritime, which was an interesting problem because coming out of Maine, the Canadians always did not like all the American stuff coming in so clear over there. They didn't care if the Canadian stuff, you picked it up here, but they were always very angry about that, which is interesting. Coming across some of my reading. Because the CBC was so underfunded, they really couldn't compete. But yeah, that's the TV one made me think of that because of the way reception works. And this would have been a great place for that. And yes, in TV stores, that's how they sold it. They would have communal groups watching TV.
Going back to the radio, executive vice president, Steve McCall,
I think Mutual still exists. It merged with Entercom and did stuff, and it became almost all sports. Larry King, it had its heyday in the 70s. I mean, in the 30s it was there, but it's where Larry King went national, and they made a lot of money on Larry King's overnight radio interview show. The tapes, I do know a producer who worked with Mutual many years in the 70s and 80s. I was part of the Radio Preservation Task Force. They turned over a lot of those tapes to George Washington University in DC. Well, you know, it's interesting because Maine is a vacation land. I'm not sure how I'm going to put this in the chapter, but in many old radio memoirs, this was the vacation place for all the radio stars. They wouldn't go out to Hollywood, or they wouldn't do anything unless they were making a movie. But so, for instance, Fred Allen, who came from Boston, he would rent a cottage in down in Wells, in that area, Orchard Beach, Wells, every summer. And all the radio stars, because the way their contracts worked, it was 39 weeks a year. The 13 weeks they didn't work were always in the summer. And so many really important radio people came up to Maine. So when you read Fred Allen's letters, he talks about Maine. He talks about, you know, the lobsters and the getaway and all that stuff. And I'm trying to think, there were Phillips Lord is the obvious example, but a lot of, Jack Benny. During the war, Jack Benny did a show about food rationing, and he made a joke about lobsters. And for some reason, it was extremely controversial. I think, I don't know why it was controversial. Maybe it was at that point that lobsters would become fancy food, and in some places in America, they're rationed, but they weren't rationed in Maine. And it became so controversial that it became a running joke on the show for weeks. And the guy, Thompson, who ran LBZ, invited him to his camp on Dover Foxcroft. Of course, not telling him that lobster's nowhere near Dover Foxcroft. Right? And they actually flew a seaplane from the coast, and they had a big lobster dinner on the show in 1943. And interestingly, I think because it was the war and rationing, they made they were kind of trying to say to people, no, he's not a rich superstar. Up here in Maine, everybody eats lobster. You know, they cook it on their porch type thing. That's a funny example of the Maine making the national airways. All right. Yeah, I guess so. Thank you very much. I appreciate this.
Thanks so much, Mike. This is fantastic.